What if the most emotional moment of Rush's Toronto return wasn't a guitar solo, a drum fill, or even one of their biggest hits? What if it was simply Geddy Lee standing on a stage in his hometown, looking out at thousands of people who had waited years to see him there again? That is what made Rush's Toronto shows feel different. In August 2026, Geddy Lee and Lifeson brought Rush's 50-something tour back to Toronto for 4 sold-out nights at Scotiabank Arena, August 7th, 9, 11, and 13. But this wasn't just another stop on a reunion tour. Toronto was where Rush's story began, and this return carried the weight of everything that had happened since the band's final 2015 tour, especially the loss of Neil Peart in 2020. When Lee and Lifeson announced the 2026 tour, Lee made something very clear. After more than a decade away, the two musicians had reached a point where they missed playing Rush's music together. But they also understood the impossible truth. Neil was irreplaceable. So when Geddy finally stood in front of his hometown crowd again, fans weren't just watching a rock star. They were watching one chapter of Rush's history come back to life. And the emotion in that room was about to become impossible to ignore. During the August 11 performance in Toronto, Geddy Lee looked out at the hometown crowd after the music had reached another emotional peak. What he said next was remarkably simple. "I never thought I'd see this again." Then came another line that hit even harder. "Words fail me." For Rush fans, those words carried far more weight than they might have coming from anyone else. Because this was Geddy Lee, a man who had spent decades performing massive concerts around the world, standing beside Lifeson and Neil Peart as Rush became one of the most influential progressive rock bands ever. But this night was different. Toronto wasn't simply another arena. It was home. And Lee was looking at a crowd that knew exactly how unlikely this moment once seemed. After Rush's 2015 R40 tour, the band stepped away from touring. Then, in January 2020, Neil Peart died after battling glioblastoma. For years, the possibility of seeing Rush perform again seemed almost unimaginable. Then Geddy and Alex changed everything. They decided to return, not by pretending nothing had happened, and certainly not by trying to replace Neil. Instead, they brought German drummer Anika Nilles into the story. And now, after more than a decade away from touring together, Rush was standing in Toronto again. The hometown crowd wasn't just applauding a comeback, they were applauding a second chance. And Geddy's reaction suggested he understood exactly how precious that second chance was. But there was still one person whose absence could be felt throughout the entire arena. Neil Peart was never going to be absent from this story. Even though he could not be on that stage, his presence was everywhere. Throughout the 50-something tour, Rush has deliberately treated Neil's legacy as something to honor rather than hide. And in Toronto, that feeling was especially powerful, because this was the city where the band's journey began. Geddy Lee had already spoken publicly about how emotional the reunion could be. Before the tour, he revealed that rehearsing The Garden was particularly difficult because he initially struggled to sing the song. And that detail matters. The Garden was written by Peart, and its reflective lyrics made it feel almost painfully appropriate for a band returning without him. Then there was Anika Nilles. She wasn't introduced as a replacement for Neil. Instead, she stepped into an impossible role, performing music that had been defined by one of rock's most respected drummers, while bringing her own personality and musicianship to it. And Toronto witnessed the result. For longtime fans, watching Geddy and Alex share the stage again was already emotional, but hearing those familiar songs with Neil's absence hanging over every note created something deeper. It wasn't about pretending the past never happened, it was about remembering it. And as the final notes faded and the Toronto crowd erupted, Geddy Lee seemed overwhelmed by just how much the moment meant. But what happened next made the entire night feel even more personal. The audience. For 4 nights, Rush returned to the city where the band had first taken shape, and the hometown shows became more than concerts. They became a celebration of everything Rush had survived and everything the fans had refused to let disappear. The August 11 show was especially revealing. After performing an emotional set that included songs from moving pictures, the crowd gave Geddy and Alex a huge ovation. Lee stood there, taking it all in. Then he admitted, "I never thought I'd see this again." And then, words fail me. Those few words said more than any prepared speech could have. Because Geddy wasn't just seeing Rush fans, he was seeing decades of memories. Fans who had discovered 2112. Fans who grew up with moving pictures. Fans who had watched Rush evolve from a Toronto rock band into one of the most respected progressive rock acts in history. And now, after more than a decade away from touring together, those same fans were standing in the band's hometown, watching Geddy and Alex do it again. But there was another extraordinary detail surrounding these Toronto shows. All 4 performances, August 7th, 9, 11, and 13, were being captured on camera, with the footage intended for a potential concert film. So this wasn't simply a reunion. Rush was documenting its return home. And if those cameras captured even a fraction of the emotion inside that arena, fans may eventually get to relive the night when Geddy Lee realized just how much Rush still meant to the people who had never stopped believing. But the biggest question remained: could Rush truly celebrate its future while carrying Neil Peart's memory with them? And perhaps that was the point. Rush didn't need to erase Neil Peart's absence, they needed to acknowledge it. The 50-something tour was built around celebrating Rush's history while honoring Neil's life and legacy. And in Toronto, that message became especially powerful because Geddy, Alex, and Anika weren't simply recreating the past, they were carrying it forward. Even the decision to film all 4 Toronto shows added another layer to the story. Geddy explained that Toronto was the natural choice because it was their hometown, the final 4-show mini-residency, and a chance to capture more than 40 songs across the performances. He also described the tour as an emotional outpouring from both the band and its fans. Think about that for a second. A band that once seemed finished was now documenting its return in the very city where it all started. And standing at the center of it was Geddy Lee. For decades, his voice had been the sound of Rush. His bass playing had helped define the band's identity. But on this night, his most powerful moment wasn't necessarily musical, it was human. When he looked at that Toronto crowd and admitted that he never thought he would see this again, fans understood exactly what he meant. They knew what had been lost. They knew how long the wait had been, and they knew there was no guarantee that this moment would ever happen again. That realization is what turned a great Rush concert into something much bigger. It became a goodbye to one era and a surprisingly emotional hello to another. And when the Toronto shows were finally over, something became clear. Rush hadn't simply returned to its hometown. It had closed a circle. The 50-something tour marked Geddy Lee and Alex Lifeson's return to the road together, following Rush's final 2015 performance with Neil Peart. The 2026 shows were framed as a celebration of Rush's music, legacy, and Neil's life. But Toronto made that celebration feel deeply personal. 4 hometown performances were captured for a potential concert film, preserving a moment that fans once thought they would never see again. And perhaps that's why Geddy's emotional reaction hit so hard. He wasn't just looking at an audience. He was looking at a lifetime, at the band that began in Toronto, at the music that carried Rush across generations, at Alex Lifeson, standing beside him once again, and, inevitably, at the empty space where Neil Peart should have been. But Neil's absence didn't make the moment meaningless. It made every note matter more. Rush didn't try to replace the past. They honored it, while allowing Geddy, Alex, and Anika Nilles to create something new. And when Geddy looked out at thousands of hometown fans and struggled to put the moment into words, those fans understood. Sometimes, after more than 50 years of music, there simply aren't enough words. There is only the music, the memories, the tears, and the realization that, against all odds, Rush was home again.